there. This is a 1935 photograph, 3 runways, and that was the common configuration in those days to accommodate all the crosswind components. Now what happens in 1935 is that the WPA replaces the CWA, and under their regulations you cannot spend federal money on privately owned property. Remember, Francis Taylor still owns the property. They required that the airport be purchased, and that's precisely what was done. So the city recorded the deed, and I kid Melissa and Belinda about this, at exactly 11:15. So at exactly 11:15 on November 1st, you best be doing something to do that. As soon as the city recorded the deed, the WPA immediately authorized nearly $200,000, and that was going to be the paving of the runways. Harry Blanchard, the barnstormer, then puts a request into the city to become the manager of the airport, which they approve. So Harry Blanchard operates as manager of the airport from that date in 1936 all the way up to 1962, with a 4-year gap in the middle where his wife becomes manager of the airport. And I know, Melissa, what's your quote? That you're not... She is not the first female director. It's actually Van Blanchard who managed it during her husband's answer. The Blanchards lived here at the airport. This is the Blanchard home right here, and these are the runways, and that's his hangar. And so we, at the evening presentation, we met several people who used to go to the Blanchards' home that has since been moved from here. But this is the airport managers during all those years. So when you look at Harry Blanchard being the manager for 26 years, Frank Miller for 22, I have math anxiety. We figured out 2030, Melissa, to break the record as the longest airport director. The runways were paved. This is an overhead shot from an airline showing the 3 runways. In 1936, the airport is leased to the U.S. Navy. They have runways. They have no other facilities out there. The U.S. Navy builds a line shack for their flight students. And as part of that line shack, they have a small tower right here. Naval aviators hated coming out here. It was a long ride from the Naval Air Station all the way out here with no facilities to fly, and then they were brought back at the end of the day. This is, until only a couple of weeks ago, this was the only picture I ever found of the first civilian terminal that they wanted to build. And then Belinda was going through some photos and found this. This actually fell out, and this is the very first terminal being built at the airport. This is the only picture. They were taking a picture of this airplane, but in the very background you can see the terminal when it was finished, and that just housed no one. It was just the airport manager because there's no airlines going into Pensacola at that time. That did change, though, when the son of a wealthy shipping magnate out of Savannah, Georgia, bought several Stinson tri-motors and established a route from Savannah to Jacksonville to Tallahassee to Pensacola and Mobile, and they would turn around and fly it out again. Unfortunately, he never got an airmail contract, and he went out of business after a few years. But that's what it is. The first scheduled airline into Pensacola is Stinson Tri-Motors. This is the second hangar at the airport that's going to come into play a little bit later. The first one was an old hangar from Old Corey Field that all Pensacola had to pay for was the bolts to reconstruct it when it came back in. The president of National Airlines came into Pensacola because he wanted to establish airline service here. And it's hard for us to imagine, but in those days, the president of the airlines was a pilot, and he would fly all the routes and make decisions on whether or not he wanted to come in. So this is the president of National Airlines meeting with Pensacola officials. What happens is National Airlines does get an airmail contract. So on November 1st, 1938, a Lockheed Electra carrying 10 people lands in Pensacola with airmail and continues on the service. And God bless eBay, because on that very first flight from National Airlines that went from Jacksonville to Tallahassee to Mobile to Pensacola and New Orleans, I have a copy of every cover that I'll be giving over to one of the museums for display. In 1939, for unknown reasons, they published this, which celebrated the establishment of the airport. But there's no materials out there to find out what happened in 1939 that they decided to do that. There's nothing in the city council records, there's no records at all. And in fact, I think we have a large frame picture outside. In World War II, in preparation for it, actually slightly beforehand, the Navy builds a 4th runway. So there are 4 operating runways with parallel taxiways and full lighting and fencing surrounding the airport. The Navy would invest over $1 million in facilities during that time frame, and this is probably the best photograph I've ever seen of the airport at its peak. However, when the Navy turns the airport back over to the city of Pensacola, there's no way that they can afford to keep 4 runways operating, so eventually they'll end up dropping it down to 2. However, what you can still see is, this is looking at the airport, and I've reoriented it so you can see the runways. These are the 2 runways operating now. See, I can just barely make out the other 2 runways. So they're still out there. And a new word I learned from Melissa is that you're digging up the old runways to use as impervious material, but they're still there, that you can still see them. This is Van Blanchard, and I know, speaking to my uncles and my dad, when you went away to war during World War II, you were gone for 4 years. My uncle went away in 1941, didn't come back till 1945. Blanchard, and I've seen clues where he's a former Army aviator before he turned barnstormer, was recalled for the war. He went overseas to China where he served, and Van served as the airport manager. I spoke to a gentleman who did flight training in this area at the time, and he said it was an all-woman operation, that the FBO and all the facilities were operated by women executives while they were here in pilots. The Navy builds the first official control tower, and I swear to goodness, when you look at that, you can hear the screen door slam as you walk into that building, but that building will stay up for at least another 20 years as the airport's tower. This gentleman, I put him in my book as an ad, and he is still alive. He is over 90 years old, and he established flight training here at the airport right after World War II. They expected a huge boom in flight training after the war, but it never materialized. A lot of them went out to business. Now, the most remarkable thing is I can tell you the precise date that a jet first touched down at Pensacola Airport, something you would never think of. Every year, the airport would host an Army celebration for nearby Eglin so they could bring their planes over. In 1947, Eglin was testing out a jet, and they said, we'll fly a jet over. It launched, it went over Tallahassee, marked on top, at altitude and speed, flew down to Pensacola and marked on top, and broke a speed record. It then circled down and landed, and the Army brought over other jets for Pensacolians to see. Now, at this point, Pensacola only has one airline. It's National Airlines, and you can go anywhere you want as long as it's Jacksonville or Mobile. They only go east-west. So Pensacola wants north-south service, and everything is under the control of the Civil Aeronautics Board, and we finally get permission in 1947 for Eastern Airlines to come in. So for the first time, Pensacola now has north-south service. Eastern Airlines, of course, is headed by Eddie Rickenbacker, the famous World War I ace. And this is one of the envelopes celebrating Eastern Airlines' first flight in. This sets up the big competition. George Baker and Eddie Rickenbacker have to compete against each other. And so what they do is they never decide on the same planes. What happens is if George Baker gets a DC-3, if Rickenbacker gets a DC-3, George Baker gets a Lockstar. If someone gets a Convair, someone gets a Martin. So Pensacola sees all different airplanes. The airlines aren't flying the same airplanes. This is a picture in 1948 of an air show being held at the airport. In fact, Jake Sturdivant, one of your persons, is in this crowd looking at the airplanes. And so what you'll see is, here's the tower. This is the old Navy line shack that was brought over for Eastern Airlines, and what you have is a National Airlines Lockheed Lodestar in the airport. That terminal is time to be replaced. So in 1952, they designed a new one. Charles Brewer actually found the original design of the airport. It cost $213,000 in order to build this airport. And when you look at it, when you compare the diagram versus what the actual airport is, it came out pretty close. In 1952, they decided to dedicate the airport, and they're going to honor Mayor Hagler. And so at this point, he had passed away. He was actually a veteran of World War I. He married the daughter of the owner of the San Carlos Hotel, and he died, unfortunately, in the hotel. So what they did was, at this ceremony, they actually had this marble plaque, which Belinda and I found way down underneath one of the terminals covered in dust. In fact, I thought you said you were going to serve food on it today. It wasn't one of the things from there? And there's actually a portrait. The oldest airline pilot I've been able to find is this gentleman right here, Leroy Brown, who was just elected to the Aviation Hall of Fame. He flew into Pensacola in 1952. He would land, then he would get a ride up to the chicken house that was there. I'm blanking out on the first name. It was a famous Hopkins Chicken House, have lunch, and then he would come back down, if you can imagine airline pilots doing it in those days. Wings of Eagles was filmed here in 1957, and as one of the scenes, the test pilot Paul Mantz flew it through one of the airport hangars, and that is actually here at the airport. And as I play it again, if you can listen, at the very end, you'll hear him scrape. Just as he came out through the airport, he scraped on one of the things. Right there was the scrape where he almost lost control of the airplane. Belinda mentioned to me that if you look at the hangar, it almost looks like the one that was still out there, and in fact, that was Bell's hangar, Odie Bell's hangar that's out there, the one that just got torn down. This is a 1960 shot, one of the few color pictures I've ever seen of the airport. So you can see that the red brick going down, you could just drive right up and park your car. There was no need for security in those days at all. This is perhaps one of the nicest pictures. People consider the Lockheed Constellation, a 4-engine plane, to be one of the most beautiful airplanes of all time. So this is a luxurious shot. But what it shows you, though, is that this is airline regulation at its worst. Pensacola can't support the amount of traffic to get on board a Lockheed Constellation. In 1968, though, the first jets appear into Pensacola, 727 Boeings, and that's going to require that the runways be lengthened and expanded in order to accommodate those airplanes. And this is the first time you have rare agreement between Baker and Rickenbacker on airplanes. They both get Lockheed Electras, which are turboprops, and then they both go to the 727s to fly into Pensacola. In 1970, you see the first airline come in besides Eastern National, and this one is Shawnee. And they call those tramp steamers of the air, and what you're going to see is these small puddle jumpers come in to either do intra or interstate travel just within a local area. In 1978, Pensacola has its first loss of life at the airport. Boeing 727 coming in at night in terrible weather, pancaked into the bay. And what had happened was the plane was in a landing configuration, so it was completely slow. It was flown gently into the water. There was a barge being pushed through the water at the time, and they were lost in the fog when the captain looked up and saw the plane pancake right aside of him. And all he had to do was maneuver his barge right alongside the airplane, and there were people that walked from that airplane right onto the barge. When we did our evening event, we spoke to a doctor who was on that plane. He was reading a book. His wife was aside of him. When it impacted the water, he thought they had touched down. That's how easy it was. And his wife turned to him and said, "I think there's water coming over the wings." And that was the first time that he knew that they were actually in the water. In 1978, the airlines become deregulated, and it's almost impossible to keep track of who flies into Pensacola after that. But if you had an airplane, you could fly it and charge as much as you wanted. One airline flew into Pensacola for 2 days before the pilot ran out of money. The company itself had no money. The pilot was using his credit card to do this. In my book, this shows you every airline that ever flew into Pensacola. And so when you look at before airline deregulation, there's only 6 or 7 that fly into the airport. However, after that, it's almost like a needle in a haystack trying to keep track of who's in there. In 1987, there was another accident. A Eastern Airlines plane came in and landed too hard, broke its back. And the rule, whenever you have an accident as an airline executive, what's the first thing you do? You cover up the airline's name. So that's why you see that tarp, although everyone in the world knows it's an Eastern Airline plane from here too. Again, it becomes apparent that they need a new terminal. Passengers are increasing at Pensacola. People are still walking across the ramp. When I came down here for flight training in 1974, I walked across the ramp to the terminal. And so this is a picture, of matter of fact, of Jake Sturdivant walking people with the umbrellas. Maybe someone here remembers those days from here. Another picture of Jake taxiing a plane in full uniform, by the way, and you can imagine doing that during a summer. So the third terminal, and Melissa, I think you said today, was the exact anniversary of it opening. 20 years ago today is when this airport opened. So it was the first time they went to 2 stories, and also they're going to have the jet bridges so that you don't have to walk across the ramp in the weather and the winds. And then it's today. And so you were all familiar with that. So that concludes my presentation.